来参加这一场 GDPR 的研讨会。那本次李律师非常的有荣幸有这个机会，让德国最大的事务所，应该说欧洲最大的事务所，Taylor Bison 的专门负责个资法和 TMT， 就是所谓的 Telecom Media 跟 Technology 的合伙律师 Dr. Axel von dem Bussche 从德国飞来台湾，给各位做这一场 GDPR 的简介。那等会他的 presentation 会以英文为主。那如果各位有什么问题的话，就是他非常 welcome 你们可以随时提问。那我现在不浪费时间，就请他先上台。谢谢大家。
Yeah. Hello everybody. Thanks very much for coming. And for this session, we have now 1 hour and 20 minutes to talk about the GDPR, and there are also possibilities. I think we have a Q&A session afterwards. So I'm very pleased and honored actually to be invited from Li and Li to come to Taipei to talk about what is really the hot topic at the moment in Europe, in the legal area, the GDPR. Everyone is very nervous. We have just 3 months to go before the deadline. The deadline when the GDPR is getting enforced is May 25th, 2018. Many companies just started with the GDPR and realized, oh my God, it's really more work than I thought before, how I can get this done in the next 3 months. So, maybe after the session everyone is relieved to say, now I know how to do it very good. Maybe you are concerned actually afterwards because you say, it's much harder than I thought before. Anyway, let's go. GDPR. Where is my pointer here? So, what we will do is I will give you an introduction about GDPR, a little bit of a background, and then it's followed by so-called, what we call organizational requirements. This is what you have to take on board. That's your must-have GDPR kit to get compliant. Then we talk about the law, how does it function, very briefly, and about afterwards the rights of data subjects, which is very important because all data subjects, these could be consumer or employee, they have quite a lot of new and powerful rights which could make the life of an employer or a company quite hard. Then, of course, very important practical implementation. After we got the theory in the background, we also would like to shed some light on the practical doing. How can you tame that beast named GDPR properly? Who knows this man? Which is it? Snowden. This is Mr. Snowden. Somehow he is one of the founders, the godfathers of the GDPR. Although they started negotiations with the GDPR in 2010, I personally, when you would have asked me in 2012, will this GDPR come into force, yes or no, I would have bet with you, no, never. Although I'm a data protection specialist since 2002, I would always have to say, no, it's too tough, it's too hard, and there's too much lobbying, very powerful lobbying against the GDPR. And the message of the lobbyist was, the GDPR, this is law from yesterday, it doesn't meet the requirements of today's technical world, we don't need that. But then suddenly Edward Snowden came with all, probably the most prominent whistleblower in the world, and suddenly everyone was aware what is possible, what's going on under the surface. I was shocked, to be honest, as well. And from there on, it was politically totally clear and obvious that the EU Commission will strike back. So it was politically impossible not to go the route with the GDPR. So since Edward Snowden, the whole development, the negotiation really got a big boost, and finally in end of 2015, the GDPR was finally negotiated, and the interesting bit was that still mid-December 2015, it was not clear yet how high the fines would be. So you all know, and this is probably the reason why you're here, that non-compliance with the GDPR can cost 20 million euro or 4% of the worldwide gross revenue. And this is really threatening. And the lawgiver said, we need these fines. Without these fines, no one will implement data protection. And there were strong currents against it. So there was a huge battle, and just like 3-4 days before the ready-made GDPR was finalized, they got the agreement of this 20 million and 4%, which I think is quite high. And that was then the boost of the GDPR. So, before we start, what do we have to consider? What is really very important as a kind of background? When we talk about GDPR, we often just think about the relation between the company and the authorities. That's what I just explained. You think, here's my company, and here's the authority, I have this high fine, and this is my problem. But I have good news for you, this is not your problem. I have bad news, you have other problems. Yeah. But first of all, I want to say why authority, of course, is one of the drivers of the GDPR, but I don't believe that this is really your main problem. The authorities, they are struggling as well with the GDPR. They really have problems because they have very many new things to implement as well. And I know quite a few heads of authorities in Germany, but also in other European countries, from seminars and discussions, and they say we are understaffed, it's so much work to do, we don't know how to handle that, and they are mourning and complaining. And for those who did a little bit more with the GDPR, if you read this Article 60 and what's coming there, about the internal rules of the GDPR. For example, one-stop shopping. This is when you have various subsidiaries in Europe, you shouldn't deal with all the regulatory authorities, you should only deal with one. So they introduced one-stop shopping. What does it mean? That means that the authorities among each other have to organize themselves vis-à-vis this very company. But how should that work? How should a Bulgarian authority work with one in Finland and in Portugal? They can't even communicate. They speak different languages. Not everyone speaks English. It's a very basic practical problem. But they have 6-week deadlines. But today, if I have a request at my authority in Germany, I get an answer back after 6 months. And now suddenly, Bulgaria and Finland have to work within 6 weeks. That will never happen. So the authorities, at the moment, have a big problem. I'm sure some companies will be fined because they need to have evidence that it's getting serious now. But this is really like the risk that it's your company is extremely low. So this is the good news. So you may think, well, I go home now into the weekend because I learned the authorities are all lame ducks. Yeah? But I told you I also have bad news. Because there are other factors which I believe are much more important. Not at all, but I'm here. Why large companies? Large companies I have here because I would like to stress the fact that, to my opinion, the main concern you have now is keeping your competitiveness. Our large companies in Europe, they beefed up their legal departments. We have companies who have up to 100 in-house lawyers who are only doing data protection law. but that's more in the insurance business, in the telecommunication business, where this is more their core interest. So, but also other big ones, they really go through the compliance process of GDPR for over the last 2 years, and guess what happens from May onwards? They expect, of course, that their contractual partners, their suppliers, their business partners, they send personal data to, that they are compliant as well. So the pressure from these entities will be quite hard, because if you cannot comply, they take someone else. And I had that already in my practice, that service agreements had been terminated due to the fact that, in this case it was a data processor in the US, they couldn't meet the required data protection standard. They were out of the game. And that's something which is happening, which is a little bit invisible, and it's not communicated in the press. So, in my eyes, keeping up to speed with data protection, or at least learning the language, communicate in the right way, will be very important in future. Otherwise, your contractual partners think you don't have it, and then they lose trust, and then they don't work together with you. So, the old days, and I'm talking about just 1-2 years ago, when business people met and they said, well, how should we handle the data? Then the other guy said, well, we just ignore it, don't we? And then they said, well, yeah, let's ignore it. Yeah? Everyone was ignoring data protection. And now you cannot make this kind of gentleman agreement that both sides ignore data protection law. That's wrong, definitely. So this is a very important factor. Another one, individuals. So what does it mean? Who knows the name Maximilian Schrems? Have you heard about Maximilian Schrems? Or have you heard about safe harbor? And that the safe harbor is dead? Yeah, safe harbor was a kind of, it was an agreement between Europe and the United States that data could be shifted from United States, from Europe to the United States more easily when companies are part of the so-called safe harbor regime. This was tackled by the court by one individual called Maximilian Schrems, who took Facebook actually to the European Court of Justice, and according to this case law, the whole safe harbor regime was from one day to the other, it was October 2015, void. Why I'm telling that story, I just would like to address your attention about the power of individuals. Under the GDPR, the individuals have quite a lot of rights, or the so-called data subjects. So you see more and more activists actually. So data, Greenpeace, nature protection, this is boring. Data protection, this is what the NGO is going for. So we have more and more NGOs, consumer data protection agencies, who are really concentrating and focusing on how to get a higher standard of data protection into the companies. And this is quite powerful, and I can tell you that the requests are already written from the activists, but that's more related to Facebook, Google, and Co., from data subjects who will ask, can I have my data? I would like to have access to my data. But what do you have? I want to have all files. They have all these rights. And the emails are prepared, and they just press the button 25th of May. Okay, work council, I just mentioned that the work councils in those countries who have a work council, this is Germany, France, a little bit Italy, they are pushing the so-called employee data protection law very hard because they have the right to participate in decisions when an employer gets new technical tools like data loss prevention tools, cybersecurity, tools or HR, travel booking, whatsoever. Whenever you get this on board, employee data is somehow relevant, and then the work council can make a work council agreement. Otherwise, you're not allowed to implement these new tools. And they are very powerful, and they are another driver of the work councils of getting in compliance with data protection law. So, but before we go there, I would like to have some questions to you. I think current situation is nearly gone. We don't need that. We go to the GDPR itself. I have some questions. There are different types of companies who are differently involved with the GDPR. So one group of companies has the following setting: headquarter in Taiwan and with a subsidiary in the European Union. So who of you, sort of, I get a little bit of a feeling about your needs, who of you is representing a company which is headquartered in Taiwan and has a subsidiary on the ground in Europe? Hands up, please. How many? Not one. Okay, a few hands, I see. Some more. Okay. Then there's the situation other way around. Subsidiary in Taiwan with a headquarter in Europe. More. Okay. I'm sure you get quite a lot of requests from the headquarter. Do this, do that. And you wonder, oh my God, are they drinking all the time? What's going on? Okay, I see everyone says yes, yes. Okay. Good, this is the second group. Then we have a group where you just provide, you have clients, only clients, no physical presence in the EU, but you have clients in the EU and you provide services to them, like data hosting, whatever. Who is the service provider to European clients? Hands up, please. Okay, service provider. And the group number 4, who is selling goods into Europe? Only goods and exchanging some data without presence. No one selling goods. Or some. Okay. I mention all these groups because for all these companies, the GDPR is relevant in a slightly different way, but it applies fully. Also, the 5th group actually, I think no one is here, who is only, or if it is here, no one would confess this, who is only monitoring data. So no physical presence, but sitting in Taiwan and tracking data as a business. No, nobody. Interesting. I don't believe you. Because I know that many who have other business, they have it as a byproduct. That I say, oh, while I have the data, why not aggregating it a little bit and selling it as a kind of byproduct? Anyway, all these groups, GDPR is applicable. Even if you only sell goods, which I personally find bizarre, but you exchange data, and the GDPR applies. Why is this so? The idea of the lawgiver was to make the GDPR very strong. And they said, I'm only strong if I have a strong extraterritorial approach. And the idea was that all data which leaves the EU should still be protected. Yeah, and how can I ensure that this protection survives once the data leaves the EU? How can I ensure this? I need the GDPR applicable also abroad. One can think, well, this is very nasty. I mean, Europe is Europe, you have your rules, why do you expand your rules to Taiwan? This is not very friendly. Yeah. What can I say? The GDPR travels with the data and is somehow protecting this data. Why is this so? And I think this is now very fundamental, but I think it's really necessary to understand where data protection is coming from. Otherwise, one won't really understand the rest of it. When we talk about data protection, we're not talking about cybersecurity or data hacking or about technical data. We talk about fundamental human rights. So the whole idea of the European data protection is stemming from human rights, fundamental human rights, privacy rights. And the idea is that when I give information about my personality to someone else, or I leave traces with my information, this information should be, which is exposed to possible access by third parties, this information still needs to be protected, although it's not with me. Just to take an example, and we talked about that earlier, Kenny. Someone is coming and sitting in front of you taking photos, click, 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 click. And you would say, come on, stop this, I don't know you, why are you taking photos? This is against my privacy rights. Obviously, you don't like this. However, if you extract information from you, for example, a photo, and this is somewhere else, no one can take care of. You are not there, you don't even know that someone is using your personal information. And therefore the lawgiver says, okay, I understand, I'm here and I protect this part of your outsourced personality. So data protection is indeed something like outsourcing your personality rights, and these rights needs to be protected wherever they are. Even if they go the long way from the EU to Taiwan, they need to be protected there. Because you cannot say no. You don't. When someone takes a photo from you, you can say no. But if the data is somewhere else and you don't know about it, it needs protection by the law. And the definition of personal data is very, very wide. So personal data is every information which is still connected with the individual. So every information about an individual is regarded as personal data and is falling into the scope of the GDPR. That means two things. The first one is, what is not personal data? Personal data is not secret information, or personal data is not technical information. So when personal data is not, when we talk about data breaches, we mean something else. When we talk about data breach, the definition of data is much wider, because it could be technical data, it could be secret information, and it could be personal data. However, we only talk about the personal data aspect when we talk about the GDPR. The other part is IT security law, cyber security law. That's different. There are connections between these two tracks. But the GDPR is only based on the idea of how to protect my fundamental privacy rights. That's important to understand, because then one maybe is more willing to accept the scope of the GDPR. The second bit is the definition of personal data is extremely wide. So all log data, for example, cookies, everything where you have a connection to an individual person is personal data. All your search history, personal data. And if we talk about employee data protection law, that's also important. The GDPR is not only applying to consumer, the GDPR is to the same way applying to employees. And I must say, the consumer data protection law is just the tip of the iceberg. In my personal practice, employee data protection law matters even more. That means all information employees are providing on their workplace, because they're using key cards, so they go in and out of their office, because they have travel booking tools, they have payroll, they have SharePoint or social collaboration tools. On all these devices, you lose, of course, or you give away personal information. Although the purpose of a travel booking tool is, of course, I want to book a journey. However, as a kind of byproduct, the employer can get quite a lot of interesting information about the employees, how they book, and what does it mean. Some are are only flying business class, others are more modest and go via economy. Some are booking half a year in advance, some booking just 2 days in advance. So you can read a lot of information out of the way how employees using certain electronic tools and how they lose traces. And there is a potential. So an employer can use all the information they get from the employees like big data. So big data business is not only consumer related. You could also say that every employer is potentially a big data provider. And with this capacity to get all this information from the employees, there is a risk that this could be misused. That an employer is getting clever algorithms who are reading the results, and the algorithm says this employee is very lazy and this one is very effective. Why don't we get this lazy one redundant? And there is this potential misuse, and that's the reason why employee data matters under the GDPR to the same way like consumer data. Questions so far? Okay, no questions. So, back to the slide. Again, I have good news and bad news. The good news is the GDPR is a regulation. What does it mean? A regulation applies directly, so there is no transformation into national law, and it applies throughout Europe. So this is a very rare piece of European law. Usually we only have so-called directives, and these directives have to be transformed to national law. And during that transformation process, member states in Europe have the tendency to implement it differently. And that happened with the previous law, that was the so-called European Data Protection Directive of 1995. That was implemented into national laws, and although the idea was data protection law should be similar, the result was it was quite diverse. And therefore the lawgiver said, this time we want to do it better, we want to have a regulation which is directly applicable, so one uniform rule for all European member states. The little downside, and that's very good, that makes life much easier if you have pan-European business. The only downside is that the GDPR has some backdoors or some opening clauses. And in these opening clauses, the GDPR allows that member states can have a little data protection add-on law in certain areas. For example, whether or not to implement a data protection officer, or with respect to employee data protection law, because that's partly labor law. There are opening clauses, and most of the European member states already agreed upon their own additional national law. Germany was the first one, and the result is that we have one big GDPR on top and still 27 little extra laws you have to consider. But I would say that 90% of the relevant law is dealt with on the higher GDPR level, on only 10% as a kind of leftover as a specific national law. Okay, then we have this famous state, or infamous state, I was already referring to. What does it mean? May 25, 2018. Does it mean the world explodes and everyone goes into jail who's not compliant? Yes or no? What do you think? I'm very happy that we have this date, otherwise you wouldn't be here. If it would be next year, no one will come to, it's next year, come on, we have lots of time. We don't have time. If you are depending on the size of the company, we have projects in Europe, of course, it's for EMEA subsidiaries or for clients who are headquartered abroad Europe but have various subsidiaries in Europe. And I can tell you the project, that's two to 3 years you need to implement that properly. For smaller business, if you of course, if you say full power, full resources, you can do it quicker, but it takes time to digest the GDPR. It's not something you can buy from the shelf, like I go in a shop and I pay a certain amount of money and I have my GDPR and I take it into my company, done. No, it's really, it relates to everywhere. It relates to the IT, to HR, to the legal department, compliance department, management. In the end, every employee has to understand what's going on. And that takes time. You know that if new things have to be implemented into a company, it really takes time until all is on board. What I want to say is, I think if you have not started yet, it will be hardly possible to meet that deadline. I would say it's impossible. But that's the bad news. The good news is, I don't regard this deadline as a kind of, I don't want to say fixed date, that it makes you're too relaxed then. But I know there will be a kind of unofficial grace period. I know that personally from regulators. I met them at a conference, and there was also an audience, and I said, dear regulator, please confirm what I believe. I believe it's impossible that companies are ready by 25th of May. It's just too much work. And how about that compromise? How would it be when the company can provide evidence that they are on a good track and they've started and they're willing to start? Isn't that enough by May 25th? And that regulator said yes. So what you really must do tomorrow's weekend, Monday, if you haven't started, you have to do the first step. You really have to get it going. You cannot postpone it for another month. You really have to start, and you have to see how far you can go until May 2025. And at least if you are able then that you have a plan, and that the plan already started, you are, with respect to the authorities at least, you are off the hook. If this is enough for your contractual partners, I said large companies earlier, I don't know, but for the authorities and the fines, I think you are off the hook. But after these 2-3 years kind of grace period where everything has to settle first, there is no excuse. So if the idea now is, I do it, I stick my head into the ground and I wait, this is just another fashion and that will go away. We can say, well, this data protection is a nuisance, it's in the digital world, it won't survive, it will go away by Industry 4.0. That's digitalization is stronger and will eat up data protection. I will say a clear no. Data protection will not get away. Data protection will be embedded in all future projects. You cannot ignore it anymore. So the strategy to say, I do nothing, duck and cover and wait till the weather changes, that's not a good strategy. That's basically the very dangerous strategy. So, now it's getting serious. This was just like giving you an overview. Now, the to-dos. What do I have to do with this horrible GDPR? What are my, we call it, organizational requirements? What do I have to put into my organization that it's running properly? The most important deliverable is the data processing register. Quite an obvious thing. You only can do compliance with the GDPR if you have an overview about your data. So the data processing register is nothing more than a kind of summary document about your processing activities in the company. It could be a large Excel sheet where you have your processing activities listed on the one side, and then you have to provide a certain set of standard information about that processing activity. For example, what kind of personal data is involved, of who are the data subjects, how long is going to be stored, are there any deletion or retention policies involved, what is the justification, what is the purpose of the use. These are standard informations. And you need it for two reasons. The first reason is all other things you have to set up with respect to data protection are somehow linked to the data processing register, because there you get all the information about yourself. The second one is that if a data protection authority will come, the first thing they ask, can I please have a copy of a data processing register? Because this is allowed under the GDPR. And that's what they will do. Before they say hello, good morning, they say data protection register. And if you say what, then it takes 2 seconds and they know they are completely non-compliant. If you don't even have a data processing register, you have nothing. Yeah? It's much better to have a rather weak one or a bad one, or at least a piece of paper with the heading data processing register. And then the authority says, oh my God, this is really crap. Yeah? But then you can say, oh, but I tried, I really tried. And then you say, I will do better. Yeah? That's much better, rather than to say, I never heard the name data processing register. This is suicidal. So this is really very important, data processing register. But don't underestimate the burden to get this information together. What do you think? How you get this information together? What would you do? You are the responsible person for GDPR, and you learn today, oh my God, I need a data protection register. And you go back to the office on Monday, what are you going to do? Yeah. You will say, well, I don't know. Very difficult. And then you realize from this, GDPR is a project. It's nothing what you can do on your own. You have to do an audit, of course. You need to know internally what's going on. You need to get the key stakeholders with respect to data protection on board. You have to talk with the IT, with HR, with bookkeeping, compliance and legal department. You have to have them all together on the table on a kickoff meeting. And then, once everyone is aware of what's going on, you have to extract the information out of the departments. And I can warn you, please don't send just some questionnaires. Yeah? That's what we do. We call it interviews because we don't do questionnaires, although the interview is based on a questionnaire. Because what happens if you send these standardized questionnaires into the departments? Yeah? First of all, the addressee of the questionnaire doesn't understand the word. Yeah? It starts with what is personal data. They don't understand it, it's not their job. So what are they doing? They get this questionnaire, they say, oh, this is really horrible, and then they ask probably the new kid on the block, the less experienced person in the department, please fill this out. A trainee who just came on board for 6 weeks, they have to fill it out. So what I want to say is the information you get, the success for a proper data processing register is dependent on the quality of feedback you get. And if the feedback is rather low, then you have nothing meaningful to put in your data processing register. So it's you need to get everyone on board, and therefore I said we do interviews. So we have these questionnaires, but we take the key stakeholders and we have interviews to explain our questions. Otherwise you won't get the proper answers. I don't want to get too much into detail, or we take that in the last a bit when we talk about practical doings, but I want to stress this now, that you are aware about the timelines in that projects and about the difficulties involved, and that you cannot just press a button and it works on its own. You first have to invest time first to understand what's going on, because GDPR, the legal subject, is quite hard to understand in the beginning. We have this kick-off session today. You have to understand how it works, and then you have to get all the information, and then you have to transform this information into the data processing register and into the other organizational requirements we are talking about now. Next one, data DPIA, data protection impact assessment. What's that? Yeah, that's something horrible as well. Correct. And this is when you have your data processing register and you have done your audit and you found out that some of the processing activities are creating a high risk for the individuals, then you have to do an extra test. First of all, of course, what is a high risk? Yeah, it's not really properly defined. However, the authorities, they will provide black and white lists with that respect. But anyway, if you think this is really a very high risk exposure, or you have sensitive data you're working with, special categories of data, it's called today, then you have to make a special test, and the reason for that test is when the risk test fails, you have to register this particular data processing activity at the regulatory authority. What else do we have? Oh, the data protection officer. This is another very unpopular topic. Everyone thinks, one question we very often must get, do I need a data protection officer? Again, I have good news and bad news. The good news is Germany lost the battle with respect to the requirement that everyone needs to have a data protection officer. We have that, and we have actually good experience. We decided in the beginning of the year, I think it was 2003, we said we don't want to have all these filings at the authorities. That doesn't make sense because it's just paperwork. We rather would like to have a competent person in the company who is the to-go person for employees, management, authorities, someone where all competence is bundled, and this person needs a certain level of independence. This person must be strong. Therefore, they benefit from labor protection. You cannot dismiss a DPO. And that again is the reason why the DPO is often very unpopular. No employer likes employees who cannot be dismissed. And therefore all the other jurisdictions were very suspicious when Germany, in the negotiation process for the GDPR, suggested everyone should have a DPO. And then the compromise was, okay, you only have to employ a DPO, data protection officer in your company, under certain circumstances, and that's more or less when data use is your core business. When you really when for example, an agency which tracks individuals to give services to banks because they have to assess whether or not you can give to them a loan. This would be a core business. Profiling. When you do profiling, data, the use of data as your core business, you need a DPO. And you need a DPO when you have a subsidiary in Germany. Because Germany made use from the opening clause, and that means if you have more than 9 employees who have a laptop job or who have a PC, then you qualify for DPO. If you have less than that, you are small enough that a DPO is regarded as not necessary. Here you don't need a DPO in Taiwan. You only would need a DPO if you receive data from Europe, and as I said earlier, the data exploitation is your core business. Then you would also need to have a DPO here on the ground. Very loud.
Sensitive data.
Yeah.
You would also need a data protection officer here.
Yeah, that's sensitive data. If you deal with, for example, if you are a service provider and you receive health data, which is regarded as a special category of data, or as we call it now, sensitive data, then you would need to have a DPO on board. That's correct.
How can we find this large scale here? I have no idea.
Thank you very much for that question. Large scale is like high risk. This is like so many things in the GDPR which is not really set yet. I cannot answer that question, but I can tell you if you are a service provider who's dealing with lots of sensitive data, in particular the health sector, we have that, and that's part of the main business, that would be regarded as large scale. It's easier to answer the question what is not large scale. This is if you are a headquarter here, and by example I gave earlier, and you receive regularly employee data because you have your server here. It's not enough that it's not sensitive data, then you don't have to implement a DPO.
Okay, and one other question. You said it's supposed to be enforceable everywhere. How would this look, for example? How would you enforce it here in Taiwan? What's the law here in Taiwan, for example?
Our data protection officer jumps into a jet, comes and jail you here. No, it won't work. Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think the enforcement, the direct enforcement from the authorities, practically going to be very hard. What they want to do for those, if you have a subsidiary, they can give the subsidiary a hard time. But if you don't have a subsidiary, but you still are falling into that category, you have to apply and you have to install a representative in Europe. So this is someone the authority can talk to. Because of that problem, the difficulties for enforcement, and that was a weak part of our data protection law in the past, the lawgiver was introducing a new principle and a new obligation, and we come to that later, but we can discuss it now. This is that those who have no establishment, but falling under the GDPR, they need to appoint physically a so-called representative in the EU. This could be a company or an individual with respective powers from the company here. And this is the person where the authority can go to, where they can send their letters. And now, coming back to your enforcement question, can they enforce against the representative? No, not really. First, in particular, if it's just a small company and there are no assets, how can you really enforce? So I think the real enforcement remains a weak point.
Okay, but so there's no, let's say, like a form of agreement between European Union and Taiwan or something, because that's
not yet.
Yeah, but that would be a way to enforce it, right?
I think we don't have civil law here. If it would be civil law, there you have international treaties where you can enforce civil law judgments, but it's administrative law. And enforcing administrative law abroad is nearly impossible. However, when we talk about fines, this is, I don't know the expression, Ordnungswidrigkeitenrecht. At least, if you go against a decision of the authority, you would have to go to the administrative court. One exception, this is a fine. When you are fined and you go against the fine, you go to the civil court. So the result would be a decision of a civil court. And this decision, of course, can be enforced in Taiwan. But it's a good question. Enforcement, we don't have experience yet, and I wonder how that works, but I could believe that it works as I just described. That if I would be an authority, I always, and I realize someone is not doing what I want to do, and they say, I'm sitting in Taiwan, please come. I would rather try to fine and then I wait until, but then of course, for example, you are here, you have no one on the ground, yeah, and you would not appear, then the decision would be against you, then you would have a court decision from a, for example, German or UK civil court, which you cannot appeal anymore, so it's enforceable, and then they would send this to Taiwan, and then Taiwanese authorities would enforce it against you. I think that would work. So, yep.
As a Taiwan domiciled life insurance company, we do deal with health data in a large scale. However, as far as EU clients are concerned, there are very few groups. So, my question is, will we still be regarding as processing sensitive data in a large scale? When we talk about the large scale of sensitive data, we should count all the clients or only the EU clients?
I would say you answered your question already. If you have large-scale processing of sensitive data, then you do it, and then you would need to install a DPO, which actually is not a problem. Installing a DPO, because the DPO here actually would not benefit from German labor law. So this whole dismissal problem would not apply here. And appointing a DPO is really very easy. You have a piece of paper and then you have some formalities saying, I appoint you as data protection officer, and you need to be, if you're not qualified yet, then you hereby commit yourself to obtain knowledge in the data protection area. Signature, done. So you could even have a fake DPO. Yeah? Someone, so that when someone asks, do you have a DPO, you can say yes.
So it's not an issue?
No, it's not an issue. It's not an issue. I wouldn't suggest in these days to have a fake DPO. I mean, that was what we had all the time. When we had the DPO requirement, I remember 2005 or whatsoever, DPO was, I don't know, the management was aware, oh, I need a DPO, they just looked around and said, you, what? You're a DPO, okay. It worked like this. But I think in these days, DPO should have a certain level of knowledge, because otherwise your clients who are not nervous now, who may be nervous from May 25th onwards, they say, can I speak to your DPO? And then the DPO is on the phone and has no clue. And that's not good. Data breach. Something which you also have to consider. Data breach notification within 72 hours, you should report every data breach to the authority. And I would say, it's for those who are dealing in the IT sector, 72 is not very much. You don't know after 72 hours, is it really a breach or is it just like something's not working? However, I would suggest just report. Report as much as you can, and I wonder how the data protection authorities will be able to deal with all these notifications. I think they won't be able. I just have to check the watch. Okay. So, security measures, also something very interesting, because this is the only part where IT security law and GDPR meets. Previously it was disconnected, now this is a part where they come together, and I think they should come together much more closely. I'm a bit disappointed that this is regarded as a kind of parallel track. However, for the first time, you have to meet certain technical and organizational requirements. That mean you need to have a certain decent standard of IT security in your company. If not, that could be subject to fines. Again, the definition what is of what you need to have is vague. it's not entirely clear. No one tells you you need to be certified with this certification and you need to have that, and then you're off the hook. But I can tell you, if you haven't invested in the last 10 years in your IT, you probably have an issue there. You know these technical and organizational requirements maybe from data processing agreements you have seen in the past, or from the so-called standard contractual clauses, Annex number 2. Because when data is sent out of the EU via standard contractual clauses to Taiwan, usually you have to put down as the data importer the technical and organizational measures you have installed to safeguard that the data is safe here in Taiwan. And this requirement you probably know from the past. Now this is in the GDPR, so not only in the data processing agreements, as an own standalone must-have requirement. This is another one which I think is very important, and this is one of the obligations which is a little bit more looking into the future. Most of the things and most of the data protection compliance is a little bit like looking backwards. Have I done everything right? This is like looking forward, because privacy by design means that you have to consider data protection from the very beginning when you now set up a new product or new services. You should, so it's a little bit data protection embedded. And when I earlier said data protection won't go away, also in the new digital world, this is one of the reasons that you are obliged by law to consider data protection from the start. That means if you now develop a new product, a really good product, and after 3 years' time you are launching it, and then suddenly it works in a way that it's processes, uses, or data in a way that it shouldn't. Yeah? Or you can only use it by breaching data protection law, then one would say you haven't considered the principle privacy by design. And this alone is subject to fines. So that means, but I see a big controversial situation here, because many people in these days, they are offering services and building products for the only purpose to collect data. How can you solve that? For example, connected cars, the whole car industry at the moment. The car is, automobiles will be the new smartphone when it comes to data collection. They're really very popular because you get so much geodata and other data, so much information. You can learn how the driver is driving, in which way, so you can have information about the character of the driver. The car is fascinating with respect to getting personal information. Yeah? But privacy by design says, make sure if you have a new product that it should not use much data. How this, so if this applies to, let's say, normal products, which are not tend to collect data, fine. But I see these days that every refrigerator these days also films, or shall do it, and collect data. Yeah? What is the family eating all the time? What do they need? Smart homes, wearables. Yeah? Every tire probably collects data. I don't know, in 2 years' time. So there is a kind of controversy in that principle where I don't know yet how to handle, but at least, and that applies to all data protection issues, it's important that you see this and somehow consider this. And my experience is that although sometimes you think data protection is such a hurdle you cannot overcome it, you always find a solution. The gray area around data protection is, on the one hand, frustrating because you never know what to do. On the other hand, once you say, okay, I take the bull by the horns, it's very good because you can be very creative and you can model around. So it allows, on the other hand, a certain element of flexibility. And here my task is, as we have this principle, you should somehow consider it. Even though if your purpose is to collect data, maybe it's possible to kind of solve this contradiction while providing your service. Material requirements of the processing. What does it mean? I actually only want to stress the legal principle, and I'm starting with this one. That's very important. How does data protection law works? It works very odd. Usually, when we look at statutory law, we as lawyers, we try to see what is not allowed. So you think this is this allowed, this not allowed, this not allowed. Here's the other way around. The use of data protection, the use of personal data is not allowed. This is the general rule. Nothing is allowed. But, and that's the exception to it, it could be allowed if it's justified. So we're not looking after prohibitions, we are looking after justifications. So the main thing is, whatever you want to do, it must be justified. And there are various alternatives for justification. One, very popular, consent. Here, I would say popular, yes, but I hardly ever saw that consent was lawfully collected. It's really very, very difficult that you need all the transparency requirements, you have the proper information, you have to store it correctly. It's a hard undertaking. And still, it could be useful in the consumer area for marketing purpose or for other purposes, because many consumers just click and say yes, and knowing this, I wouldn't hesitate and ask for consent, because without consent you may run into issues. However, for employees, when we talk about employee data protection law, again, it's not recommendable to do that, because one of the preconditions of consent is that consent has to be given with a free will. In many employee-related situations, the employee has not free will. The employee thinks, if I don't sign this, if I don't agree, I have a problem, so I better agree. This consent is not valid. So in the employment situation, you only can use consent for offerings of the employer which are not really relating to the business. Some add-on offerings, like if you, employer, I have, I don't know, thinking about a silly example. If you want to use this special tool, which has nothing to do with your workplace, you can do it. However, I need consent for that. Otherwise, not. It's your decision. Yeah. So for everything which is not obligatory, you may use it. I know that many people still have in their employment standard agreements consent. That, of course, doesn't work at all. Yeah? Because, of course, an employee will sign the contract with that clause. And the clauses I see, it always says, dear employee, good that we have you on board. Actually, we want to do with your data whatever we want, and don't complain. Please, signature. Is there a free will? I don't know. Of course not. So that's actually quite counterproductive, because you document a wrong consent. That's better to have no consent. And if you still would like to address information to your employees in the very beginning, what you can do is you can inform in the contract, and you can refer to a kind of a general data protection policy of the firm, but don't combine it with a consent. Other legal justifications. There are two I would like to highlight, which are relevant for you. The one is you can use personal data you got during a transaction. So data protection you need to conclude an agreement, because that happens very often. You are entering into an agreement with your clients, and the data you exchange and which you need to do the envisaged business, this is justified. You don't need an extra justification for that. And that happens very often in day-to-day business. You buy a book from Amazon via the internet. This is a contract. The data Amazon needs for that contract, this use is justified. However, everything on top, not. And we don't know about everything on top very often, but that's another story. Another very important justification is so-called legitimate interests. Article 6, paragraph 1, subsection F. This is the core justification. And there you have the so-called balancing test. You, as the party which would like to use personal data, you can do it when you have a legitimate interest. And everyone would say, oh, of course I have business interests, many interests are possible. However, these interests have to be outbalanced with the interests of the data subject, so the person who gives away the data. And there you have to do the balancing test. And then it's getting very legal, because you need to have some, you do to have some legal research to really find out how you balance properly. But that's what we often do for our clients. Client wants to do something, no one really knows where we look for the justification. We don't find a, let's say, direct justification, no consent, no contract, then we say legitimate interest. And then we somehow create their justification because we make a legal investigation, and oh surprise, the result is, well, it's justifiable. But what we often do during the test, we find out that we say, during the balance, well, if we leave it like this, you may lose the balancing test. But why don't you change some things, like restricting the access to the data, or implementing some additional measures so that the data is less used and better protected. And then suddenly the balancing test goes in the direction into your favor, and you can say, well, it's justified under legitimate interests. So the legitimate interest principle, I like it very much, because with a certain creativity and flexibility, you often can find a justifiable solution. But it's not sufficient only to say, okay, legitimate interest, full stop. You need to somehow think about it and do something with that. Changes for processors. Who's a processor? Two types here. Often actually a headquarter, which is processing data on behalf of their subsidiaries in the EU, is a data processor. If they only do the processing, if they're on top, do something more, like using the data for all purposes, they're also a so-called data controller, and the GDPR applies under the regime of a controller. But if you are only a processor who is, let's say, in the outsourcing business, you have a software as a service business here, or you do data hosting or whatsoever, and you're not at all interested in the data as such, you just do the technical work, then you are still directly responsible under the GDPR. That's new, we haven't had that before. So you need a data processing register and some other requirements under the GDPR I already explained. Data transfer. That's nothing changed there actually. The law remains unchanged. but I still would like to highlight data transfer because for you this is very important. All data we are talking about today for you first was transferred from the EU. So all data you have is subject to a prior transfer of data. And this transfer of data is regulated as well, because there's a general principle that says the data is only, EU data is only saved in the EU. And whenever the little innocent EU data leaves the EU, it goes out into the cold and cruel world, it needs extra protection. This is the idea. And the idea is that at the side of the importer of the data, an adequate level of data protection is required. And there are various possibilities how to get such an adequate level of data protection. The easiest is that your jurisdiction is regarded by the EU Commission as a country having an adequate level of data protection. Taiwan, it's not the case, but like Switzerland, parts of Canada, Israel, they met the so-called adequacy test, so you can more easily export data. Another one is binding corporate rules, but this is has anyone installed binding corporate rules in your company? Merck? You as well? It's quite a big undertaking. Binding corporate rules only make sense in a large company because installing it is quite a heavy burden. It's not so easy to obtain, and the way how most of you, I believe, what you would use are the so-called standard contractual clauses. The EU Commission has developed a set of standard clauses, model clauses, and if you use them one by one, please don't amend and don't even discuss the clauses, because if you discuss the clauses with the client who would like to send you data, they know that you don't know how it works, because you can only use these model clauses one by one. It's not really a contract. Yeah? It says standard contractual clauses, but in a way it's mandatory. If you want to amend the clauses, you have to register them with the authority, and that takes far too much time. It's too complicated. However, yeah, please.
Data analysis and AI products. So I'm wondering, are there any categories of legitimate interest or kind of data that is assumed legal or can be analyzed by the authority beforehand, whether to improve customer experience for the product itself, or whether if they retrieve data for the purpose of analyze other products of the company, then it is banned or not?
Again, it really depends on the very product and how they set that up, but that's of course one of the typical examples where you have the big question, how does it work in the new digital world with all the new digital products, with artificial intelligence, with everything, and you have to find a compromise there. And one option would be to anonymize the data. If it's anonymized, then you're out of data protection anyhow. But if it's more like, if you say you want to create a better customer experience, then of course anonymization doesn't make sense because you want to track this very person. Yeah? Then you would need consent actually. Yeah? You cannot track people anymore without asking them upfront.
So even if not with a legitimate interest, it can get customer prior consent to get the data as well.
If you have prior consent, you don't need legitimate interest. The question is, do I have legitimate interest? Yeah? And that's going to be very hard. I know that, of course, many companies are just doing it, yeah? Without asking anyone, and many consumers, they don't bother. Yeah, and 98% say do what you like. But still, the law is quite strict. They say only the legitimate interest, because I like to do the business, that's not enough. Yeah? And you need to look out of the perspective of the data subject, and then you have to say, you can say, well, the data subject, they shouldn't bother. But that's not a strong argument, to be honest.
Right, because based on my understanding for most of the technology product right now, they will ask consumers consent beforehand.
Yeah, that's no problem.
There are the templates of hundreds of clauses, so consumer basically have no choice but to click on yes and then to the next page.
And then we come to the very interesting questions, and there was just a recent case law where PayPal's terms and conditions have to be regarded as invalid because they were 80 pages long. Yeah? It's going to be quite interesting how this is going to be solved, but I would always work with consent. Better to have a consent which is probably tackled than to have no consent, because without consent you cannot do that, and you won't win legitimate interest test.
Thank you.
Okay, I speed up. I just learned 10 minutes, now it's 9 minutes. With the data transfer, one thing I would like to highlight, because that's often mixed up. You have a two-level justification. We talked about earlier, the most important, everything is not allowed. However, it must be justified. This is, and if you transfer data to Taiwan, first of all, the use of the data, so what you want to do with the data, must be justified. This is the ordinary justification. However, if it's shipped out of the EU to Taiwan, on a second level, on the transport level, you need an extra justification. And this extra justification are those I just mentioned. I just highlight that because many people think only because they have standard contractual clauses, they can do everything. It's justified. Yeah? They think, I have a contract, I can do what I like. That's not true. These standard contractual clauses only work on the transport level. You still need the real justification for the very use of the personal data. Now, in the last 10 minutes, I just mentioned that very briefly, data subject rights, because I mentioned that before. I think all what you need to know is that they have lots of rights suddenly. They had that before, it was never triggered, but now as they become so visible and popular, I'm quite sure we will see more activities here. And this is a new right which was developed, which is my favorite one, data portability, because I wonder what this all will create. So you can, the idea was from the lawgiver that want to prevent a lock-in effect. You shouldn't be locked into into Facebook. It should be easier for you to go somewhere else with the data you have there. However, it's going to be interesting to see what's going to happen. My prediction is, with that principle, we make the monetization effect of data more visible. Currently, it's under the surface, so the advertising industry, they know very well about the value of the data, but with this data portability effect, I think it will go through the surface, because I could imagine there's a provider who's saying, dear customer, please come to me, and if you take all your data, you will get an extra dollar. So it becomes more visible, the value of personal data, with many, many interesting legal implications, in particular with respect to civil law. But that goes too far. Because I would like guidance. There's some guidance actually from the authorities on the websites, but I must say it's good guidance, but you have to search for that. And it's only 50% of what you need is already accessible and available on the website. You will need another, as I said, 2 years until everything is settled and you have proper guidelines from the authorities. But I want to talk about practical implementations. This is part of your, I think, of your material. There must be something called step plan. Is it on your material? So it's a 2-pager or a 4-pager actually. And this is more or less a summary out of that. This is how I should really, how I should get that on board. And we talked about that already, therefore I can talk about it a little bit more quickly here. The first thing what you really have to digest is you cannot buy it from the shelf. It's really, every company has different needs. And you first have to do a little thinking. And I call it kick-off meeting. With my clients, the first what we do is, before this, they often say, I want to be GDPR compliant, can you please give me an estimate? It doesn't work like this. You first have to know, what do you really need? Do you looking for new artificial intelligence product? Are you looking for employee data protection? What is your current status? Do you have already a data protection register, yes or no? It's very, very different and individual. So I want to warn you when someone is coming and trying to sell GDPR from the shelf. It sounds very compelling, yeah? Because it sounds so easy, but it simply doesn't work. You can buy it and you can lose your money, but it will have no effect. So the first thing is the gap analysis. And you see, here's the law, and here I am, where's the gap? The interesting part of the gap analysis is actually, what we find out, the gap is not in the law. The law is very similar to the old law. The gap is reality and the law. Because in reality, as we already mentioned, many, many companies have disregarded data protection law. So suddenly, what should have been done in the last 20 years must be done in 1 year. And this creates all this kind of nervousness and explosion, I must say, on one end. After the gap analysis, when you know what you have to do, and I said already, I suggest that you incorporate your findings in the data processing register, I would recommend that you have a risk analysis. You should find out what is the most risky part of my business. Do that first. Make a list of priorities and start with the most pressing issue. However, what is also important, what I partly mentioned, management backing. You need your management understanding about the wide scope and implications of the GDPR. You need the budget, you need the personal resources. Otherwise, as I said earlier, you cannot do it on your own. It's impossible. Second, and it helps very much that you have these heavy files. This is what management makes nervous at the moment. And many of our, let's say, contact persons in companies, they use that. They were banging on the door as at management, top management, 20 millions knocking on your door. Please open. And it works. Secondly, you have to realize that it's a project. You have to organize it like a project. You need responsibilities. You need milestones. Probably regular calls with the team. You need a kind of data management structure in your firm. You need people you allocate, you can talk to, who kind of obtain a certain knowledge of data protection. And you need to have them on track with trainings. So you have to go away from this typical legal thinking, oh, I have a new law, and I look just into the statutories and have some consequences. You really have to take it on board like a project, and you have to organize it respectively. Without proper project management, it doesn't work. And the last thing here is responsibilities. Someone needs to have the hat on. And what I often experience when we have the kickoff meeting, the first meeting with the key stakeholders I mentioned earlier, and then we're sitting together, 5 people, and then I ask this question. I said, one of you should be responsible. As one must be in the lead. And then everyone is like this, pointing with the finger to the other. No one wants to do it. And I always say, why? It's so interesting. Yeah? But obviously everyone says, I have already a job, and this sounds like a second job. Yeah? I don't want to take that on board, but that's an issue which needs to be solved. Some of our clients say, well, then we have a team supervisor. That doesn't sound so responsible. Okay, let's call it team supervisor, if this is easier to digest. But someone should lead it. Otherwise, you sit together and it somehow blurs away. Okay, we come to the end. That's what I said already. Project steering. Yeah, this is one of the doings actually within the audit, that you not only look into your internal data structures, you also have to check your current data transfer agreements, data processing agreements. And this is what we already mentioned. And the last point I already mentioned, designation of one head project manager, or we call it team supervisor. And now, actually, I think after nearly 1.5 hours, you can write books, or you can buy books. It's a fine thing if you're not bored enough. And that's it. That's Europe, more or less. This is the danger zone, which you have to consider. So, thank you very much for listening.